Welcome to the journey home. Tonight our topic, on the surface, may not appear as deeply theological as others we may cover from week to week, but in fact it is extremely theological, for it is a very important part of our Catholic faith. It's a topic that, on the one hand, separates us very clearly from so many of our other Christian brothers and sisters, but also is the topic that has drawn many home to the church. And that topic, for want of a better word, tonight, we'll be talking about the physicalness of the faith, the things of the faith, the statues, the icons, the pictures, the aids to prayer like the rosary, the things of our faith that are there to draw us, to focus us on our Heavenly Father. Our guests for tonight found in their own life that the things of the faith were one of the ways that the Lord drew their attention to the Catholic Church. Gary and Gayle Summers are here to speak with us tonight about the place of the things of the faith in their own journey. They have so much to share with us, and so as usual, we have to kind of focus their journey to fit into this window of this program. You're an important part of this program, so I want you to remember to call us with your questions. The number you can call us is 1-800-221-9460. You can also contact us by email at journeyhome@EWTN.com. Welcome.
Hi,
Gayle
Marcus.
and Gary, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Marcus.
It's great to see you. Have to make you travel all the way to Birmingham for us to get together, even though you've been a part of the Coming Home Network for a long time.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
And boy, again, there's so much that we could talk about. In fact, I could easily do 2 shows here because of both your journeys, but maybe rather than wasting time with my gabbing, why don't you jump right into it and tell the audience about at least your early years of your journey of faith.
Well, thank you, Marcus. I can remember early on being raised in the church, being raised in an independent evangelical church in Michigan, and going to church every opportunity the church was open. We would go to church all the time. It was a wonderful church and a wonderful tradition in that it focused on inward spiritual conversion. And I can remember from an early age being confronted with the gospel and the opportunity to give my life to Christ, and I did. And I grew in that faith, even during the difficult teenage years. And during those teenage years, my faith was so important to me that I even considered going to seminary. I ended up going to Wheaton College, and during
That's
that...
almost a seminary.
It's almost a seminary, right? I prepared. I took 3 years of Greek and a couple years of Hebrew. And during that time, though, I felt a call to study philosophy and work in universities, teach, or perhaps be an administrator. So I went on to get a master's degree in philosophy, and then I went to work at Gordon College. At Gordon College, we attended an Episcopal church in Hamilton, Massachusetts, Christ Church. And that was really our first exposure to the liturgy. It was a wonderful experience for us because it brought the inward spiritual reality into time and into space. And I think it was the same for you, Gayle. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience.
Right, well, my early background is different from Gary's because we were an unchurched family. So we grew up not knowing anything.
I think a lot of people today don't realize that there still, in fact, are people in this country.
Yes.
Lots, right?
Right. We were clueless. We didn't go to church, and we had no concept of the gospel, or I barely knew who Jesus was. But when I was 18, I was invited to go to a Presbyterian church, and I went purely for social reasons. But when I got there, I was quite surprised to find people who were talking about knowing Jesus in a personal way. And it flabbergasted me. It really did impress me deeply that people could be so confident about knowing God. So one of those people gave me a Bible, and I started reading the Gospel of John. It was a Billy Graham Crusade Bible, actually. So when I was reading the Gospel of John, each page I turn over, I got maybe through 10 chapters. And by chapter 10, that was it. I knew that I wanted to belong to this person that I read about. So I actually gave my life to Christ when I was 18 and started going to a Presbyterian church. And then I was active in InterVarsity in college and wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, but at a certain point it was clear to me that I wanted to know more about the Scripture, more about theology. So I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where you were leaving and I was leaving and you were coming. I think we missed each other that way.
Right.
And I got a
You would have
master's
been there
degree.
when Steve Wood was there.
Yeah, I graduated in '76 from the seminary.
All right.
And I was a Presbyterian and a Calvinist, and I wanted very much to work on the staff of a church, which I wound up doing actually in Michigan. I worked on the staff of an evangelical church with women and college students for 3 years. And that's where Gary and I met and got married, and our two stories became one. And when we went to Massachusetts, we became Episcopalians, and we were actually very impressed with the liturgy without any kind of real reflection on it. We didn't think too hard about why we found it so satisfying, and yet we knew it was very satisfying to us. And we were happy Episcopalians for many, many years.
And even at that stage, the Episcopal church we attended celebrated the liturgy with dignity, but it didn't have statues. There weren't lots of outward symbols of the faith in the church. So it was almost like a halfway house for us, because it exposed us to liturgy, it exposed us to ritual, but it brought us in slowly.
Slowly. And I know at that time Tom Howard was a part of your life too.
Yes, right. We were friends with Tom and his
during
Tom was a very
he
good,
was an Anglican.
Yeah, a very good friend of ours at Gordon College. He and his wife are the godparents of our first child. They're very dear friends of ours and very influential, really, in our conversion story, because it was, I think, my exposure to Tom, first of all, that, well, not solely my exposure to Tom, but my exposure to Tom got me to think seriously about Catholicism. And when I first met him, he was struggling with the decision to become a Catholic. He'd been away for the summer, and he'd been reading all kinds of Catholic books, and he came back, and it was very much on his mind. He was really struggling with it. And I was part of a group of fellows, young fellows at Gordon College, who met with him on a monthly basis. We'd sit around and drink beer and smoke pipes and talk about C.S. Lewis, pretend to be like the Inklings. But we struggled with him at that time. And I came to really appreciate his decision to go to the Roman Catholic Church.
Which was very difficult.
It was an extremely difficult one for him, because it meant the loss of his job and the loss of his career. But I was not ready at that time yet to make the move myself.
Since the topic we want to focus on tonight are the things of the faith, statues and pictures, share a bit what you would have thought about these things, or what you did think of these things back when you were an evangelical, on the staff of an evangelical church, or back at Wheaton, let's say.
Well, I can think, initially I remember growing up in Michigan that my initial reaction to Catholicism was, this is paganism. Here are people who are worshiping objects, and I know that there's a real inward Christian faith, but it doesn't appear to me that they have it. It appears to me that it's all outward, that there's no inward conversion going on. So my initial reaction to crucifixes and to icons would have been one of wonderment and I think amazement, perhaps, but not really thinking that they were Christian at all.
Yeah, and I can remember seeing statues and people in front of statues and assuming somehow that the statue represented sentimentality on their part, particularly statues of Mary. Because it seems to me, well, these people think that they are not actually good enough to take their prayers to Jesus, so they're going through his mother. And in some ways, it seemed as if either it was a faulty theology, or it was just a simple, uninformed sentimentality, or maybe an ethnic thing. I mean, I can remember thinking, people from the old country have brought these pictures and statues, and it reminds them of the old country and the old life there. And too bad for them that they don't know that they can
phrase,
be.
Too bad for them. I think that's, I probably shared the same view. I wasn't anti-Catholic, but I thought these poor people,
too bad. If only they knew.
They just need Jesus. They don't know all the stuff. And I remember seeing on television at some point a processional from South America or something, where all these thousands of people are following the statue of Mary. And I remember thinking, these poor people whose faith is caught up in superstition.
Right.
But I didn't understand.
No.
Right.
And we didn't take the time to understand, did we?
No. As a matter of fact, we were taught, this looks almost like a violation of the Ten Commandments. You're not supposed to make any graven images, are you? What are these things anyway? And then we were also very fond of quoting Jesus's commandment that we would worship in spirit and in truth, in spirit. That our worship would be a spiritual thing, not a physical thing. So this phenomenon was totally unknown to us and impenetrable, really. Yeah.
Well, what is it then that opened your heart eventually to the Catholic Church?
Well, as I said, we attended Christ Church in Hamilton, Massachusetts, and that was our exposure to the liturgy. And we became involved in the Episcopal Church, involved in matters on the diocesan level. and very much involved in our local church and very appreciative of the liturgy. On the one hand, I was engaged in discussions with Tom, talking with Tom all the time, and I came to appreciate his move to the Catholic Church, and I came to believe that that was a legitimate option for people, although it wasn't really for us, right? During this time, Gayle was busy raising children and probably too busy to think about most of these things. But I thought about them, and I had a respect for the Roman Catholic Church. But again, still, that kind of piety was a distant thing from us, something I couldn't understand. It was really with the breakup of our church in Hamilton, there was a huge fight over some internal matters, that we went one Sunday for refuge to an Anglo-Catholic church, an Episcopal church, but a very high church in downtown Boston called the Church of the Advent. We went there for respite one Sunday from the battle that was going on in our local church, and we felt so at home there immediately that we never went back to our old church.
Yeah, that visit to the Anglo-Catholic Church, I reckon, as far as I can see it, was the beginning for us, because the church was a beautiful church. It was filled with statues of saints and angels. There was a gorgeous high altar. There were 7 tabernacle lamps, golden lamps hanging from the ceiling. It was just a beautiful church. There were confessionals in the back. There was a Mary chapel on the side. In all respects, it was Catholic, except it wasn't Catholic. It was a fake Catholic church. But when we went in, of course, we were somewhat beaten down from our situation in our own church, because we were right in the center of the collapse. You know, it was very difficult. So, but from the moment that we stepped into the church, when we looked around at everything that was there, our theology should have prepared us to be appalled by those things. And yet, both of us, I think, felt from that moment that we were loved by God, that God was somehow loving us and welcoming us through the building itself. This was a very strange thing for us, you know.
Comforted and at home. And to look and see the statues of the saints was to think, we're not alone. We're surrounded by a cloud of witness. And it was a comforting thought in the midst of these theological battles that we'd been engaged in, to know that the church had stood for 2,000 years and would probably stand for 2,000 more, and that there were people who confessed the faith through all kinds of trials, much worse than what we'd experienced.
Right. It was a moment to be reminded that the church is actually God's enterprise. It's not up to us. And as Protestants, we were so used to carrying the church on our backs that for the first few weeks that we were there, when we were there, we can talk about our reactions now, but when it was actually happening, it was very hard to articulate. We just knew that something wonderful was happening to us. And the only way that I could describe it at first, and it sounded ridiculous, was to say to my friends, I feel like hundreds and hundreds of pounds are falling off of my back. I feel light and airy. And I believe it was because the church reminded us that this is God's kingdom. He will take care of it. He will see it through to its completion. And it was the first occasion for us to really kind of comprehend this notion that somehow the grace of God can come to human beings through the stuff of the earth. Because that's what we saw around us, the stuff of the earth.
As I was thinking, as you were both describing that, I was thinking how the images around us that remind us of St. Teresa or St. Francis draw our focus away from us, away from me.
Absolutely.
To these people who have walked the faith before us, who've suffered the way, not just the way we have, but 100 times more than we have.
Right.
Yes.
And have seen the grace of God in their lives.
Well, and the crucifix itself draws us right into the
Stations of the cross.
The central suffering of our faith.
Did you come in immediately?
No. Actually, it was...
Sounds like we should have, but...
Sounds like we should have. It was actually, in one sense, a very helpful place to be, but in another sense, a dangerous place to be, because we became very comfortable there. Yeah. And the liturgy was done marvelously. There was a beautiful professional choir that sang wonderful music, and it was like heaven on earth in every respect, except that it was not in communion with Rome. And initially that didn't disturb us. But because of my experience with Tom, because of our conversations over the years, and because of conversations I'd had with a friend of mine at Northeastern, a fine fellow named Phil Crotty, a devout Catholic who I had lunch with every week, and we'd talk. He was, I think, secretly trying to get me, but he would simply present the faith to me, the Catholic faith to me. Over time, I began to question really the claims to authority of the Episcopal Church. And that created some tension because here we were so happy there, we were so comfortable there, we were involved. I was teaching a high school Sunday school class, and you were doing some other things. You were doing Sunday school. Our kids were happy there. We'd made friends. It would be very difficult for us to leave that environment. But on the other hand, we had reservations about the claims to Catholicity of the church, and it was a difficult situation, a difficult tension.
It was. And when we started to read, we knew that we had almost gone too far. You know, we got to the point of realizing we are going to have to come to some conclusion about this. We are not going to be able to just ignore it anymore. So we're going to have to figure out what's what. And so we started reading, and we read, well, I read Romano Guardini, and we both read the Catechism. And it was actually the reading of the Catechism that finished us off.
Yeah, my friend Phil, as soon as the Catechism came out, gave me a copy of the Catechism. And I read it and was struck by the wonderful pastoral tone, the incredible spiritual depth of it, and the bigness of the faith. When I was younger, the faith was a small thing and it was an individual thing. But here I was struck with how big it is, how broad how it stretches across time and across cultures.
Every culture, every language.
A wonderful thing.
Yeah, and I remember being impressed with the way the Catechism comes out almost as being God's love breathed out into words. I had read a lot of theology, as you know. I mean, we did a lot of theology when we went to seminary, Calvin's Institutes, and so I had read a lot of theology in my life, but I had never read anything as beautiful as the Catechism. It made me cry, really. I never wanted it to be very far from me. It's funny, we were talking about how sacramentals, you know, dispose you to grace, but I never wanted the Catechism to be too far away from me physically, so I would put it on the kitchen counter when I was cooking dinner, or I'd put it on the sofa when we were out watching TV, because I wanted to read it word for word, and I didn't want it to be very far from that book at all. And by the time it was over, we had read it from cover to cover.
Which we want to encourage all of the audience to do. It's not just a book for reference.
No, it's a wonderful, wonderful book.
It's a huge book.
I suppose we could include Catholic books in the category of the things.
Yes.
The things that draw us to Jesus.
Yeah. Right. Because for us, I mean, that's very true for us.
Yeah, Catholic writers were extremely influential, I think, in even turning my attitude towards the Catholic Church in the first place. It was in college that I first read G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and I was astonished at the time to think, well, here's a Catholic who has true faith. Now, I know that sounds awful, but it was the truth. And I had the same reaction reading Walker Percy, and I think Gayle had the same reaction reading Flannery O'Connor.
I remember reading her letters, and I admired her fiction, and I didn't know that she was profoundly Christian. And when I read her letters, it was very clear that here was a Catholic woman completely untouched by evangelical hands, had never, ever come into contact with evangelicals. And yet her whole outlook on life, her understanding of her art was profoundly Christian. And it was through literature, really, that I recognized that maybe I had been wrong about the Catholic Church, or that whether a person could actually be born again and still be a Catholic.
Would you agree that maybe, in some sense, the reason so many people do not understand the Catholic Church is because they've never read Word One, written by a Catholic?
Oh, yes.
Absolutely. We'd read lots of things about Catholics. I can remember hearing sermons about why Christ didn't establish the church on Peter, you know, or why the Eucharist wasn't really the body and blood of Christ. But I never heard what the Catholics really taught about it until I was exposed to the Catechism and Catholic writers.
Why don't you take a moment then and talk to the audience about what does the church teach about the things of the faith? What do we really, why do we have statues and pictures and rosaries and such?
Well, it's interesting. The Catechism teaches that these things are sacramentals, and what they do is they dispose us to receive grace.
What is a sacramental?
A sacramental is something that isn't a full sacrament. It doesn't actually give grace in itself, but it disposes the soul to receive grace. It puts you in the proper position to receive it. So all of these things really are designed to put us in the proper position to receive God's grace. God's grace is flowing through the sacraments, but we're not always in the best frame of mind, in the best condition of soul to receive it. Sacramentals then put us in position to receive them.
I just thought about that. I know that there's a sense in which Jesus always used word pictures in his parables. And it's very possible that when he's speaking to the people about a grain of wheat or a mustard seed or a rock, that he's not just saying it, but that he's pointing to it.
Yes.
It's like a sacramental.
That's right.
It's exactly what his parables were to do.
Absolutely. That's the way Jesus taught. Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Well, I remember being impressed in the section in the Catechism about holy images, because I had a Protestant friend from seminary who was just beside herself with the possibility that I could be in a communion that didn't mind statues of Mary. She was just beside herself. And I had to read the Catechism so that I would know how to answer her about holy images and whether it's permissible to make a representation of Jesus or the Blessed Mother. And the Catechism is very clear about it. It's not as if we're making an image of God. That is still prohibited. But because Jesus was a man, a human being, it is permissible to make a representation of him in his humanity.
It's probably important to point out that even back in Exodus, when Moses gets the instructions, on the one hand, in the Ten Commandments, not to bow down to these graven images, that he also gets instructions on making cherubim for the top of the Ark of the Covenant. So he's making graven images. The difference is bowing down to them.
Exactly.
That's the point.
Right.
That's right. And I think ultimately there's a wrong emphasis in theology that says you cannot use things in the world because God created the world. God created the world and he created it to be good. It's a good thing. He also acted in time. The story of salvation is the story of God's redemptive acts in time. And all the signs and the symbols around the church recall all of those acts, his acts in creation, his acts in redemption, his ultimate act in Christ's death and resurrection. So all of these things really show us that God is working in history and that he's using things and that he's not afraid to use us and to work inside of us as well.
They're to draw us away from ourselves, away from all the things in our life that cloud our thinking, to see, and sometimes in a picture of a saint, we see a virtue, or we're reminded of the struggle that was victorious in grace, or we see what Christ has done to us, or we see Mary and all that God has used her to. This is what all this is to draw us.
Yes.
And ultimately, as some would say, it takes away from God. No, it draws us through all these things which are in essence transparent to draw us beyond.
That's right. Draws us much closer to God. That's why the doctrine of Mary is so important, because Mary is necessary to ensure the humanity of Christ. Christ couldn't be our sacrifice if he wasn't a human. If we don't honor the Virgin Mary, we're in some way denying the incarnation.
Why don't just take, for example, a couple specific, particular images that maybe we see differently now. Maybe the first one, just to take for example, is the crucifix itself.
Well, the crucifix represents the central mystery of the Christian faith. It's Christ suffering and dying for our sins and for our salvation. It's interesting because Protestants will often have empty crosses, which seems very strange. I think Chesterton said it seems very odd to celebrate the instrument on which someone was killed and not recognize the person, So putting Christ on the cross reminds us of the suffering and the death and the agony, just what pain it took to win our salvation. And it makes somehow our pain and suffering in the world much less difficult to bear, I think.
And when a person kneels before a crucifix, we're not worshiping this piece of stone or wood. What we're doing is remembering. We're worshiping Jesus. We're looking beyond, but we're recognizing. Well, as we look, even now, I think the image might be on the television screen of the crucifix. I'd like to read a passage from Galatians, which I don't know how I took this passage before as a Protestant. I think I've read this on the show before, but it says in Galatians 3, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified.
Yeah.
What did Paul mean?
Well,
Except that very early on,
that's right.
is it that someone saw in the power of this image a reminder of all that Christ did for us. Another image, which of course is very powerful but can be divisive amongst the different faiths, is Madonna and Child.
Right, yes. And I can remember even in my early time of being a Catholic, being confused about the Madonna and Child, and feeling a kind of impatience with it, you know, that, well, it's nice to think about, but really Jesus isn't a baby anymore. Let's just get on with the important part of his life. The Madonna and Child were really an enigma to me. But the more I read, and particularly it was doing a Bible study in the book of Genesis, when I saw in Genesis chapter 3, the very first promise of redemption to mankind comes by God saying to the devil and to Adam and Eve that it would be a woman and her offspring through whom the defeat of the devil would come. And it kind of literally leapt off the page to me, a woman and her child. Of course we would have an icon in our piety of the woman and her offspring. They represent the beginning of the end of the devil, for one thing, and they represent the triumph of redemption. So that to me now, when I look at the Madonna and Child, what they represent is entirely different from what I would have misunderstood before. And actually, the Madonna and Child says much more to me than just that. I mean, to me, it's a statement of the humility of God, who would be willing to entrust his kingdom into human hands the way he has. The willingness of Mary, a simple girl, and a powerless person really, on the fringe as far as power goes, who said yes to God and became the means whereby man is saved. You know, these are profound spiritual truths. And I wouldn't want to live another minute of my life without being able to look at a Madonna and Child now.
And it's sometimes hard for us Americans because we have our American culture, and then, especially coming from a non-Catholic background into the Catholic Church, from a non-Catholic American Protestant background, to see not just a Madonna and Child, but Madonnas and Childs from every culture of the world that are brought to this country by all these believing brothers and sisters who have, in the way they've drawn the Madonna and Child, they've also expressed their culture and their understanding. Like Eastern icons, which are a glorified Madonna and Child, what they're supposedly like. I'm not very good explaining icons, but the way they are in their heavenly state, I mean, it's a difference. But as I think about how we should see the picture of Madonna and Child, I'm reminded of that scripture text where if we envision a picture of Mary and Jesus and remember Jesus' words, behold your mother.
Yes.
That's what we should be saying in our heart, behold your mother.
Exactly.
Behold your mother. Because that's what he did to John. He pointed to his mother, drew his attention to his mother. Not that he should worship her, no, but remind that we're part of a family.
That's right.
And she's the mother of the church.
Well, when Mary's there at the beginning in Genesis, and she's there at the end at Revelation, and
sure.
her role as the God-bearer is important there. So,
Well, there's so many aspects of this topic we can focus on. Maybe before we take a break, let's talk about the books as the things of the faith for a moment. Maybe comment again about the power of Catholic writings.
well, there was a long line of books that were quite significant. G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy was probably my first introduction to Catholic thinkers. I read Newman, in particular Apologia Pro Vita Sua. That's right, that's what did it. I know a number of people have been influenced by the development of Christian doctrine. That's another significant book. Reading the fiction of Walker Percy was also significant. Walker Percy was a convert and was one of the greatest 20th century American writers. His Catholicism was probably not very well understood, and not always on the surface of his books, but deeply embedded in them. And particularly reading some essays that he wrote about why he became a Catholic, and some conversations that he had were very significant. Reading The Spirit of Catholicism by Carl Adam was also extremely significant.
And when we come back, we might be able to talk about a couple more books, especially if the audience would like to know a few, because some of these writers you mentioned are almost forgotten folk. And a lot of times when you study their lives, they became forgotten because their Catholicism became more vivid. men like Belloc and Chesterton, became forgotten in literature because they were taking vivid stands on their Catholicism. And so it's up to us to kind of bring these people back up and encourage the audience to read some of these great authors. Let's take a break. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment for your questions to our guest tonight on this topic of the things, the important things of the faith. Welcome back to The Journey Home. My guests for this evening are Gayle and Gary Sommers. Our topic are the things, the physical things of our faith that draw us to Christ, the statues, the icons, the pictures, the articles that help us in our prayers, things that where we came from in our spiritual journey before we were Catholics to us seemed like idolatry, but now we've come to understand they're an important place in drawing us closer to Christ. We ended the first part of the program talking about readings, books as the things of the faith, another thing that draws us. And they're just words on a page, right? Isn't that like a painting? I mean, in a sense, a lot of people bow down before books, okay? But used correctly, they can be a message of us. I thought during our break that maybe to ask you, what one or two books would you recommend to someone in the audience who's never read a Catholic book before? Good place to start.
Yeah, I was very, very impressed by The Spirit of Catholicism by Carl Adam. I can remember just being shaken to the core when I read that book. I didn't know that such books existed. It really was a jolt for me, because as I read it, the reasonableness of the faith, the comprehensive truthfulness, the timelessness of the Catholic Church is on every page of that book. And it's not a very long book. That's another plus. It's not a big tome that you have to plow your way through. I would recommend that. And also a book that profoundly affected me was The Lord by Romano Guardini, which is a life of Jesus. And of course, as a seminarian, we had lots of lives of Jesus around us all the time, and I was very familiar with lives of Jesus, but I had never read anything like The Lord by Romano Guardini. And it was actually, I have to say that this was going on at the time we were at Church of the Advent, and I read it one chapter at a time, because it's a lot of chapters, but they're short, about 5 pages each. And it had an effect on me very much like the Catechism, in that I never wanted to be very far away from the book, the physical book itself. Jesus, in each chapter of that book, was luminous to me. And I can remember being consciously mystified about how a writer of theology could write a life of Jesus and make it like that. I knew it had to be more than technique. It couldn't possibly just be a clever writer's technique, but there was some kind of knowledge and experience that Romano Guardini had of the Lord that was palpable and that he was able to put in his words. And I found this just very powerful, drawing me towards the Catholic Church.
I'm going to save my question until later.
Well, I'd have to say also The Spirit of Catholicism was extremely influential, and then Newman's Apologia was also very influential.
Well, those are hard places to begin.
They're hard places to begin. I think Orthodoxy, again, would be another excellent choice, although it's more along the lines of mere Christianity, right? I mean, it's more of a defense of the faith in general, rather than a defense of the Christian faith.
Well, and now I think Tom Howard's book on being Catholic
will be
a classic.
Yes, it will be a classic.
Yes.
I do believe that.
I would strongly recommend that book for interested people.
Yeah.
And maybe, again, just to throw a couple thoughts into the audience, depending on your reading interests. I mean, that's another thing, that books on conversion stories are always, there's plenty of those out today that are always helpful. You might encourage those, especially if you like biographies. And I like Hilaire Belloc, How the Reformation Happened. I found it's a fascinating book. So those are some good ones. As you were just, I'll save my question. We've got some emails. Let's go to those. I have a fairly broad question. As a former evangelical Protestant who just joined the Catholic Church this Easter, welcome home.
Congratulations.
Is there anything I should keep in mind during this initial adjustment period? It seems to me that it can be just as difficult as the process of examining the church. Thanks, Joseph and Susan.
Well, Joseph and Susan, welcome home, and you're right, it can be very difficult. We were very fortunate in that we were received into an RCIA program that was just ecstatic to have us, and we actually encountered as much fellowship, as the evangelicals used to call it, in the Catholic Church as we did in our Protestant churches. I think that many Catholics coming in feel isolated sometimes and begin to question what they've done. I'd focus in on the sacraments and daily reception if possible. It took me a while to learn to pray the rosary, but I would encourage you, if you haven't started praying the rosary yet, to do it, and to learn to pray the rosary, and perhaps the Chaplet of Divine Mercy also. They're wonderful aids to prayer, wonderful aids.
You know, I remember as a Catholic, a new Catholic, feeling still as if I didn't have my bearings completely at the beginning, and it took time, especially with Mary. You know, I accepted the presence of Mary into my life purely out of obedience. Just purely out of obedience. I felt nothing for Mary when we became Catholics. She didn't mean anything to me. And in many ways, she seemed like she was being intruded into the picture. I mean, I think you understand what I'm talking about. We didn't have people in the picture. So that even after I became a Catholic, Mary was an unknown to me and a source of some confusion, not theologically, but as far as my feelings about Mary.
I've often described it as, I used to pray just Jesus and me, and all of a sudden my prayer closet got real crowded because there's Mary and Joseph and the saints, and how did it
kind of
threw a wrench into my whole devotional life. I didn't even know how to go on from there, and I think this person that wrote the email said, I think she was Presbyterian, right? Is that what she said, I think, or evangelical?
Evangelical.
Well, what we often didn't recognize is so much of what was a regular part of our previous faith were based on an anti-Catholic reaction.
Right.
And it takes a while to work that through when you come into the church.
Yes.
The system is different.
Right.
Of the whole church, the way things are done, everything is a bit different.
Yes.
So to be patient. It was almost a little bit like Jesus getting baptized and spending the days in the desert where you may go through difficult and dry times.
Yes.
So we encourage them to get spiritual direction if possible.
And to just be patient about it, because I believe that it does happen.
Let's take our first phone call tonight. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
Hi, my name is Rita. I'm from Pennsylvania.
Hello, Rita. What's your question for us?
Okay, my question is, with the couple that have just come into the Catholic Church and their appreciation of everything that is Catholic, how do they feel about, I mean, there are so many Catholic churches, the newer ones, that are completely devoid of statues. They seem to be going just the opposite. It's sometimes even hard to find a Catholic church. It has to be a very old parish. It seems that the new trend, and especially with the communion rail, you don't find a communion rail. And part of my problem is I'm a former Catholic, and I married a Protestant. And he was Methodist, I was Catholic. Our compromise was the Episcopal Church. He has just grown to love the liturgy, the beautiful Episcopal liturgy so much that was not in the Methodist Church. And the only reason I was able to join the Episcopal Church was because they kept that, they had that spirituality in the liturgy. That was still home for me. But, you know, we still have the communion rail in the Episcopal Church. We have, I see with the Protestant brethren a reverence for, they may not have as much as the Catholics, but what they do have, they revere.
Thank you very much. I knew this question would come up in our discussion because it is a question. I know that many of us, when we come into the church, we start to understand the meaning of these things just when we find that in many cases people are getting rid of them.
That's right.
What do you think about it?
Well, the Catechism would teach that these things aren't of the essence of the faith, but that they're important aids to the faith. So I think we need to keep that in perspective. But I would encourage anyone building a new church, anyone involved in building a new church, to take into account what the Catechism teaches about these things, that a church should be a house of prayer and should be designed in such a way to foster prayer and to encourage prayer, to signify the communion of saints, to signify God's saving activity throughout history. Church architecture is extremely important, I think, and we need to have those truths illuminated in the architecture of the church. I just have one note, too. I can understand your reluctance to leave the Anglican liturgy. That was probably my biggest stumbling block just before we became Catholics. I will have to say that I've become used to the Roman liturgy, and I've actually grown to love it. And the liturgy that we found at Church of the Advent was the highest liturgy you could find anywhere in the world. Had the finest music, was done just superbly. So losing that initially to go into the Roman Catholic Church felt like a great loss to me. But I've come to really appreciate the Roman liturgy, and I've come to appreciate the sacrament, because it's ultimately the sacrament that feeds us. Would you like to add anything?
Well, I have thought a lot about this issue of how should churches look, because I taught a class in Hebrews in the church that I go to in Phoenix. We had a wonderful time studying Hebrews. And it was an occasion for us to think very carefully about what is actually going on when we're in church, what has happened in the New Covenant. The New Covenant, according to Hebrews, is a fulfillment of the Old Covenant. And the Old Covenant religion was very sensual. It was unapologetically sensual. You know, that Moses was told to make a replica of what he had seen on Mount Sinai, and that replica was not a replica of what was in heaven, but it was a copy and a shadow of heavenly realities. But the religion that God gave to Moses was a sensual one. There were things to see and things to do and smells to smell. And so why would we imagine now that in the New Covenant that Old Covenant religion would not be fulfilled in some way? You know, when we were studying Hebrews, it was clear to me that there's a big difference between the word fulfilled and abolish. And it occurs to me that much of my Protestant life was in a church that felt that it needed to abolish religion of the Old Covenant instead of fulfill it. So that Catholic churches that are thinking of becoming more like Protestant churches, I would just say study the book of Hebrews and think about it.
Yeah, when I see that happening, and I thought a lot about it too, in some sense, because the first Catholic church that we attended had statues and pictures, but in a limited sense. And of course, I've now visited many churches and have seen some where they've just removed everything. And when I see that, and I have to be careful here because I can't read anyone's heart, but I sometimes wonder if they've lost track of the meaning why we have these aids to our faith, and have abandoned some of the true meaning of why these things are in our faith, for the goal of being ecumenical, and missing what John Paul II calls us to when we think of what it means to be ecumenical. We don't sacrifice the truth of our faith to be ecumenical. But I mean, the other faiths, like the Episcopal Church, which isn't a fake church, we don't mean that when we say that. That's not you know. What we believe is that in what has happened over the last 500 years in the separation of church, the different aspects of our faith have been set aside, partially because of misunderstandings, sometimes out of reaction against abuses, or reactions against things that we didn't like or didn't see clearly. And so our goal as Catholics, especially when we're kneeling before a statue, okay, it is hard.
Yes, it is.
For someone to see what's going on here when they see us kneeling before a statue. So we have to recognize that as a teachable moment so that others can understand what we're doing when we're kneeling before a cross or a picture. They need to know us. They need to know our heart.
Yeah, it fits in with Vatican II's universal call to holiness. We're called to be holy, and people who see us and see our holiness and then see us revere icons, revere the crucifix, will then see that there is a connection between these objects and holiness. And that's really what other Christians need to see in order to make these things not a stumbling block to them.
You had mentioned earlier that the rosary was one of these images or icons that was a bit of a struggle for yourself.
Yes, right. You know, before I became a Catholic, I just thought the rosary was creepy in a lot of ways. You know, just a very strange, foreign way of praying. And to me, it looked entirely useless. And I started praying the rosary actually before we became Catholics, because I knew we were headed in that direction, and I knew that saying the rosary was part of Catholic life. And even though I felt very wooden at it, and it felt very strange to me, I started praying the rosary. But I would say that it's really been in the last year and a half. Now, we've been Catholics for 3 years, but it's only been in the last year and a half that the landscape of the rosary now is familiar to me. And it is very hard to put into words for a Protestant what actually happens when you're praying the rosary. In some ways, it's so difficult to describe that sometimes I feel as if our conversion into the Church has added almost another sense to the five senses. There's a sixth sense that simply is not experienced by people who have not walked through the door of the Church. But it opens us into a kind of prayer that we didn't really understand or even dream possible before. It really, it's probably the rosary represents the biggest transformation for me.
And I mean, there's so much to the rosary.
Yes.
The meaning by the scripturalness behind it, the stories behind it, the repetitions of the biblical prayers, but there is also the physicalness.
Yes, right.
Of the rosary.
Yes.
The physicalness of it. It's very important. It's interesting that Gayle should mention that, because I'm in a Bible study with a group of other Catholic men, and we were just looking at Matthew 6, Jesus' teaching on prayer. And the typical Protestant response to the rosary is, well, you're violating Jesus's command not to pray like the heathen. You know, don't pray like the heathen. They heap up all these phrases, empty phrases, one upon another, and expect that will make them heard before God. So we talked about that, and the initial response of all the Catholics was, these aren't empty phrases. They're extremely meaningful to us. They're very...
the Lord's Prayer.
They're the Lord's Prayer. So that they're not meaningless repetitions. And unfortunately, I think Protestants think of prayer as talking to God, period. Right? The Catholic thinks of prayer as communion with God, spending time with God, some of which may be spent in conversation, some of which may be spent just in the presence of the Lord.
It reminded me, that was my earlier question I was going to bring up, and that is that the physicalness of what we might call prayer aids connect with a different kind of prayer than we were all that accustomed to, the issue of meditation and contemplation as prayer, which we're not a part, at least of my Protestant experience.
No.
And that is to sit before an image and reflect on its meaning behind it. And I think that even we ought to encourage our Catholic listeners, many who maybe have lost track of that very important part of our Catholic piety.
Right.
It's a deepening part of which focusing on like the Stations of the Cross, what they mean. And why did they develop in the first place? Because a long time ago, when there were people who couldn't read the Bible. And so the pictures helped them to discover and then to memorize their faith. Coming into the church, and maybe as we close here, time goes so quickly on this program. Coming into the church now, 3 years into the church, and as we look at the topics we've talked about, how have these things of the faith helped you grow in your relationship with Christ?
Well, I'd have to say that the things of the faith have truly encouraged me and developed my faith much more strongly than I would have imagined. It's as if God is just pouring out His grace upon grace on us now, because through the sacraments we're receiving Him, body and blood. It's hard to put into words, really, because it's an inward reality. It's hard, and it's hard to talk about, but there's no question in my mind that the sacraments have deepened and broadened my faith and my trust in God and my relationship with God in ways I can't really articulate.
You know, I've thought about this a lot because it's probably experientially the most dramatic difference between being a Catholic and being a Protestant. And I also find it very hard to articulate. The closest I ever get to it is to say that something like the rosary, touching the beads of the rosary, holding the cross, doing the Stations of the Cross, standing in front of a picture, that at all points, at all times, at every moment in my walk with Christ, my body and soul are one. They are together. They'll never be separate. And this is just, I mean, it sounds very simple, but it feels as if when I was a Protestant, I only knew about the soul. I was a sort of disembodied soul or brain, or maybe a brain and a heart together somehow. The body was inconsequential. And yet I lived 99% of my time in my body. And in Catholic life, because there is the body and the soul are never separated. In the sacrament of reconciliation, you know, you go in and you confess your sins, and there's going to be something that you do in your body. So that sacramentals, I think, have done that for me, kept the body and soul together.
Well, thank you very much for both being on the program. It's been a joy to be with you, and I hope our discussion of these things of the church have not only strengthened our faith as we journey, but also help those in the audience to appreciate the things which are very much a part of this church. Thank you. We'll be with you just a moment for some final thoughts for the journey home. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guests tonight, Gayle and Gary Sommers, have helped us talk about the importance and the meaning of the things of our faith, statues and icons and pictures, aids to our prayer, things that we regrettably admit have caused separation. Separation because many do not understand where their place is in our lives. And we can't point fingers. Sometimes it's our own fault. Sometimes we haven't made it as clear to those in our lives around us why we have pictures in our wallets, why we have things on the walls, why we have things on our tables, why we have things on the dashboard of our car. But you know, they're teachable moments. They're times for us to use these items as a way of showing our family and friends the depth of our faith. Thank you for being with us. Look forward to being with you next week on the Journey Home, and we'll talk about other important aspects of our faith as together we follow Christ faithfully in His church. God bless.